government one of the few opponents of tough immigration controls.
By the time I was Home Secretary, the question of illegal immigrants, people coming in vehicles to the ports and coming in, was a major issue. You'd think that every night half of Pakistan or Asia was padding up the beaches of Dover, the way everybody believed it was going on. It did go on to some degree.
Far from fostering good race relations in Britain, the drive to keep out illegal immigrants often made matters worse.
Why are my children apart from me? Just because of these racist laws?
My recollection of Anwar Dita's campaign was that she came to symbolise a much wider problem.
Rochdale, Lancashire. Anwar Dita lives here with her husband and 4-year-old daughter.
I was born in Birmingham, brought up in Rochdale. I was sent to Pakistan in 1962. I was married in 1968. I had 3 children there. And my husband came to England in 1973. I followed him in 75. And after the birth of my 4th child, that's where all my hell of the life began.
When Anwar tried to bring her first 3 children from Pakistan to join her, the authorities refused them entry. The Home Office became suspicious about a discrepancy in Anwar's story. Anwar had married her husband twice, once under Islamic law in Pakistan, then 7 years later under British law. The first time she'd only been 15 and they'd lied about her age, so Anwar's date of birth was different on the 2 marriage certificates.
They said there's 2 Anwar Ditas. One Shujauddin married in Pakistan, the second one that he married in Rochdale. My answer to that was, I'm the same person.
Anwar's children had to remain in Pakistan for 6 years while she campaigned against the Home Office's refusal to admit them to Britain.
I had to go to give fingerprints and thumbprints.
I gave them photographs, I gave them loads of details what they needed of the children.
Lie detector I offered myself. Blood test I offered myself. I even offered the Home Office that I'll pay for the investigation for somebody to go from the Home Office. All these things weren't accepted.
They are cruel and they're bloody liars, the Home Office. That's what I think of the Home Office.
The more they, said no, the more determined I was to prove that, I'm not a liar. It's the government that is lying.
I'm going to fight till the last breath in my body. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep fighting on because they are my children. Nobody in the world can prove that they're not mine.
Bring Anwar's children home! Bring Anwar's children home!
So the last resort was going for internal medical examination to prove that I gave birth to more than 1 child. And that was the really, hard thing for me. That was really bad. It was like, how can I describe it? It was like being abused by consent. That's how I felt. By law, you can do this to me, to prove that these are my children. And I can never forget that, never.
In 1981, the Home Office finally surrendered to the weight of evidence.
The children arrived in Manchester 6 years to the day after they last saw their mother in Pakistan. Their father had flown over specially to collect them. At last, the reunion. Mrs. Dita wept, the children were dazed, and they hardly remembered the mother who'd fought the Home Office for 6 years to bring them to England.
Even when I think about it, what I've been through, you feel so depressed and you say, what the hell? Why did I go through all this? All those questions wouldn't have arisen if I would have been white.
The pressure to check the numbers entering Britain at Heathrow filtered down to immigration officers.
I was once told if I wasn't too sure about how to interpret the rules, or I felt unhappy about it, perhaps I should interpret them as this particular chief immigration officer had done, which was to say, well, did I want the particular person standing in front of me, living next to me in 10 years' time?
One test became notorious.
They started examining women to see whether they were virgins or not, on the grounds that no Indian man sending for a woman would accept someone who wasn't a virgin as his potential wife. So therefore, if the woman had lost her virginity, she was phony. She was trying to get in on other grounds. And this actually went on at Heathrow Airport Terminal 3.
The virginity test was one of the things one couldn't quite believe was really happening.
After the scandal of virginity tests became public, the Labour Home Secretary put a halt to it.
Actually, I think it was so gross that it was one of those milestones that started things being improved.
The most extreme features of immigration control, which had so poisoned race relations, seemed to be disappearing. But there was soon a new twist to the politics of immigration.
I now propose to take a turn to the right, which is very appropriate.
Up to this time, both Labour and the Conservatives had resisted the temptation to play the race card to win votes. But in the run-up to the 1979 election, the new Conservative leader had no such qualms.
World in Action asks Conservative leader Margaret Thatcher about immigration, unemployment, pay policy, and about her future relations with Edward Heath and Enoch Powell.
People are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And you know, the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in. So if you want good race relations, you've got to allay people's fears on numbers. That's one thing that's driving some people to the National Front. They don't agree with the objectives of the National Front, but they say that at least they're talking about some of the problems. Now, we, the big political parties, if we don't want people to go to extremes, and I don't, we ourselves must talk about this problem, and we must show that we're prepared to deal with it.
Mrs. Thatcher's comments immediately polarised opinion.
I think Mrs. Thatcher's remarks are very much racist.
I think she's perfectly right.
And I do.
She is talking racialist language, and she is making the National Front more respectable in the eyes of the British people.
I normally disagree with everything that Mrs. Thatcher says, but I think this time for a change it does make a bit of sense.
The Shadow Home Secretary appeared to be firmly behind her.
Don't you think perhaps that the use of the word swamped was a little emotive?
The fears are there, and she was saying what those fears were, and she's right. They are there.
Willie Whitelaw was in the Shadow Home Secretary. He'd been building bridges to the immigrant community and so forth, so blew up those bridges and infuriated him. And he certainly at that time, for a few days, very strongly contemplated resigning, which would of course have been a very grave step to take, because not only was he Shadow Home Secretary, he was Deputy Leader of the party.
In some quarters, Mrs. Thatcher's remarks were even less well received.
I remember going to see the Indian Prime Minister, I think it was in number 10 Downing Street, and I followed Mrs. Thatcher as always, and I was sitting waiting, and she came out of the room and stumped past me without even saying good morning, disappeared out the door, and I went in, and the man was sitting fuming. He was saying, terrible woman, terrible woman. And I said, it could be worse. She could have promised to take back India. So he just laughed, and we got on all right after that.
Many considered that Margaret Thatcher had finally given in to the temptation to play the race card.
Well, you must judge that.
I think the swamping remarks were designed to win votes, probably.
I think swamping was a carefully calculated word intended